Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Anthony Costello, and this is the Equal Justice Podcast. The Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. And boy, I'm getting that motto out quickly these days, gentlemen. Tells you that we've been doing this for a little bit now. I am joined tonight by Jacob Daniel.
Hi.
Of course, that's Dr. Jacob Daniel to you. Josh Matayka.
Hey guys.
Still joining us from the land of the free, Josh, in Florida, or where are we?
Yep, back in Florida again today. You never know. Each week changes.
Lucky son of a gun. Logan Zeppieri, whom I agree with on everything. And our guest tonight, Lenny Esposito. Lenny, I always feel like, I don't know what movie it's from, but there's this movie where somebody named Lenny walks in and everybody goes, Lenny. So I feel like we kind of have to do that anytime we have you on. We all have to go, Lenny. But I can't remember.
I am the norm of apologetics podcasts. Yes,
Yeah.
that's
Lenny's been doing this for quite some time. So we're glad to have him with us. Gentlemen, the question that we had on the table for tonight deals with the idea, the notion, the sentiment of Christian nationalism. So our driving question tonight is going to be Christian nationalism, threat or blessing? And as is now our tradition, Jacob Daniel, can you please lead us off with some initial thoughts on Christian nationalism? Should we be worried about it, or should we be promoting it?
Wow, that's a huge one. But let me start by saying, welcome, Lenny. It's such a joy to have you on the show. I always enjoy doing radio with you on apologetics.com. So it's an honor to be here again.
Thank you.
A little shout out for Harry Edwards there too, as well. Everybody.
Yes.
Who we will link to.
Now, with Christian nationalism, there are two terms there, right? Christian and nationalism. And let me elaborate on the term nationalism, because I believe most of our audiences are Christians and they would understand what a Christian is. I hope so. Nationalism, it's one of those terms. It's difficult to say what it is than defining what it does in the minds of people. It's much easier to know what it does because people are encountered with the outcomes of it personally, even through media or in family relationships and things like that. So let me elaborate by saying that there is a kind of nationalism that obscures the cross of Christ. So let's look at the wrong options first so that we can have more clarity in terms of which is the right one. As Os Guinness always says, contrast is the mother of clarity. And I hope we'll do that tonight, even through this show. So there is definitely a kind of idolatrous nationalism, which basically promotes some kind of like racial superiority or ethnicity of a group of people, which is definitely, as Christians, we would understand is wrong. It's ungodly. It adopts a kind of Nietzschean way of engaging with culture. And as Christians, we are not called to do that. But on the other hand, there's also another way of wrong way of saying that there is no proper form of patriotism or nationalism. And I personally believe that as a Christian, we have been given a clear mandate in terms of render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and render to God what belongs to God. There is a proper kind of being a citizen of a nation. And I personally believe it is throughout the scripture we see time and again in terms of people belonging to a nation, to a kingdom, where they perform what is required of them under God's leadership. That model is available throughout the scripture. Now, to define nationalism itself, we need to understand that, first of all, that the very notion of nation is God's gift, or God is the author of nations. He is the one who forms nation. We see that in the book of Genesis itself, which is kind of contrary to the very idea that was being promoted at that time at the Tower of Babel, the very idea of globalism, right? All languages together, all people together, just opposing God in some sense. Whereas here is God then distributing them into 70 nations. So God himself is the author of nations, but we need to understand that in our culture, because of the impact of different ideologies and thoughts, we have somehow, we are, especially here in the Western world, we are abandoning this idea of the idea of nation being Christian itself. And that's dangerous. But there is a way for us as Christians, we are called to be in a nation and to, because God is the one who establishes this very structure of governance. There are three structures, as we always talk about: nation, family, and the church, right? God is the author of these structures. And as Christian, we are called to actually conform within those structures as long as it conforms within the very standard that God establishes.
All right. Well, that's great. And that's a great lead in. It gives us some clarity already right off the bat. I mean, Josh, do you have anything that you'd want to add just to some of Jacob's initial thoughts there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so it's funny on this topic. I was recently listening to it was a podcast by Quick to Listen from Christianity Today, specifically on Christian nationalism, and they mentioned I believe it was I could be wrong on this, but I believe it was a Pew Research study that showed some high percentage. It was well over 50%, or I believe it was over 50%. We can fact check this later, especially in today's world, right? Of Christians believed that the Constitution was equal in inerrancy with Scripture. That's at least the claim, right? And so that kind of belief, it would be considered a Christian nationalistic thought.
I'm sorry, Josh. You said that people believed the Constitution of the United States was inerrant in the same way that Scripture is inerrant?
Yes, in the same way that it's God breathed. I think that was specifically the wording of the question. And we'll have to find this later and link it to the study. And so that, I think, is the concern on people's minds when it comes to is what are we prioritizing? Are we prioritizing Christianity, or are we prioritizing government and country? As Christians, we know that the fundamental bedrock for the way that we live our lives needs to be our faith. That's I think pretty straightforward. And beyond that, patriotism, it has value, right? Insofar as it aligns with the biblical narrative and what God's word has to say. The problem is when, as Christians, we put politics over the Bible. And so when you're talking about Christian nationalism, I think Christian nationalism is not, if it's defined in that way, it is not a good thing. However, the second question that comes to mind, and maybe we can discuss this a little bit more, is how prevalent is that in our society? And from more of a pragmatic standpoint, what kind of damage is that causing?
Okay, well, I think this is probably one of the criticisms that people are bringing up of, that is part and parcel of the threat of Christian nationalism. And people will talk about the moral majority or the Christian right. And I guess the claim would be that, but it's certain Christians who are trying to enforce some aspects of the gospel through the vehicle of politics, through the mechanism of politics, right? And then, of course, when Trump came on the scene, it was thought that this is now being actualized, in a very, at the highest level, that the gospel is trying to be propagated through just politics.
Like
right?
when he showed the Bible in front of the I don't know if it was the White House or that one building that he walked to, and I know that angered a lot of different Christians.
So let me ask Lenny.
Street.
Lenny, do you think that that is part of the criticism against Christian nationalism? Do you think it's a straw man though? Is there
I think there's a lot of caricaturing going on and posturing. Labels have always bothered me, because they're reductionistic in their approach, and they tend to oversimplify things. So it's easy to throw a whole bunch of people together and say, for example, the January 6th Capitol, event that took place. It's a fascinating study if you actually listen to, and by the way, nobody's really done this, for all the decrying of the actions that have taken place on January 6th. And believe me, I'm with them on many of those things. You don't hear many people interview the participants and hear their side. And it's fascinating when you do. There are a few out there. And so these people, a lot of them said that they were swept up in their emotions. Their whole point was to make themselves known, right? And many of them were Christians. And so you had some key actors move through the barricades, push into the Capitol. And once they got there, they all looked at each other and said, well, what are we supposed to do now?
Yeah, what you can see on the video is really weird.
Yeah. And somebody said, well, so somebody went up to the dais and they said the Lord's Prayer, for example. Well, that's a strange thing to do.
For an insurrection.
For an insurrection is to, well, we prayed, we took a few Instagram pictures, and then everybody kind of filtered out, Yeah. And so there were Christians who were part of that, but it's easy then to say, you see, those Christians were motivated to do insurrection because of their Christianity. And it's easy to throw even individuals and it was fascinating. This one individual that I had heard his interview, he said, now when I look back on it, I wouldn't have done it again. But you weren't clear-headed. It's very much like any other sin or emotional response, even I would dare say, in the various Black Lives Matter protests that happened throughout the different cities where individuals were raiding stores and things like that. There's many of those people who might have looked back on it and said, man, that wasn't good, right? I did this when I was a teenager. I can remember one or two incidents where my friends did things, and I look back now and go, boy, that was stupid. Why did I do that? Because you're caught up in the moment.
I stole a door once. Why did I do that? Because my other friend said, hey, let's do it.
Right, exactly. So this is the problem with terms like Christian nationalism. It's easy to create a label and throw everybody into a bucket.
Yeah.
And not understand their motivations, nor nuance some of their situations that are going on. The problem also I have with the label is kind of what Jacob and Josh had already expressed, is it puts the emphasis on the nationalist, right? It's a nationalist. And in today's society, especially amongst those on the more progressive wing, to be a nationalist is actually to be jingoistic. They equate those two ideas. That's not necessarily true either. The biblical model that I see is the command that we are to love our neighbor. Now, how does that get expressed? Who is our neighbor? It was the Samaritan. It was the person who didn't have blood relation with the man beaten, because the man beaten was Jewish, but they did share a common border. Judea and Samaria were still both ruled by Rome, and they were considered, right, part of either Herod Antipas or Pilate's domain. They were considered contiguous by Rome standards. So they were one nation at that point in their political structure. And that's who we're supposed to take care of. How do we take care of our neighbor? Well, we can do it individually. And I think that was the primary thrust of Christ's argument, but also we do it through our governmental means, through our politicking means. This is where just war theory is all about. This is exactly what Aquinas was getting at when he's formulating this very specific concepts of just war theory, because even nation against nation, you have to rescue those who are oppressed, even if they're in another nation. Right. So who is our brother? Do we have to protect our borders because we're protecting our brethren? Absolutely. And I think that puts a completely different spin on this concept.
That's good. Well, I know Logan's probably brimming to get in here on that. I do want to say though, in this era of having things online and people wanting to go back into every skeleton in the closet, my friend and I did return that door that we stole the next day. So just everybody,
After
be
thinking it
canceled.
over.
don't call the police on me 25 years later. Or,
Yeah.
now 35.
Wow.
Logan, go ahead and let's get you in here, because
Yeah.
Lenny just said a mouthful and a lot of good stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, between Lenny, Jacob, Josh, there's a lot to cover. The question, again, it's situated in the context, as I think Lenny rightly pointed out. You have the labeling, but there's the picking up of this. Nationalism is kind of a bad term to be thrown around. And growing up, I didn't have that association with nationalism. Nationalism, American nationalism, was almost synonymous to being a patriot. Being a patriot seemed synonymous to doing what's good for the country. I didn't come into direct contact with nationalism as sort of a bad word or a bad label until I went and studied in England. And I guess just for the audience, while I was in England, I competed in dance. And so while we were waiting for the next round, me and this American individual were laughing because we discovered that one of the songs that we sing in America when we were in elementary school was the same tune as the English national anthem. Or yes.
Yeah.
And so we were just laughing. Oh, we kind of changed the language.
God save the Queen, right?
Yeah, exactly. God save the Queen. And the English, citizens, that were part of the dance club, we were at Oxford, and they overheard us say, "You sing songs about your country in your class?" I said, "Yeah." And they're like, "That's like some form of crazy nationalism." I'm like, well, "Yeah, I mean, we support our country and that's what we do." And she's like, "I could never imagine that happening here or in another country." And I was like, "Well, why?" I said, "Obviously you had Germany." And then she talked about English's history and France's history. And then I started thinking about Japan's history and China's history. And I thought, it's interesting. It seems like there's an import in national media. Maybe I'm stretching this too far, that when you look at the world field, a lot of nationalism quickly slid into some sort of ethno-nationalism or some sort of racial nationalism. It became synonymous. The Chinese had Chinese, the Germans had German, right? So Germany had Germans, France had French, England had English. So then I started thinking, I'm like, well, then it's peculiar that then American nationalism just doesn't have the ethnic or racial foundation to have a German nationalism with the United States that takes over, or a Spanish nationalism, or a French nationalism, or a Hispanic nationalism. And there's just no resources. And so I think the first things when we start talking about the word is, where is it being imported? So when you see like The Economist flagging it, or Der Spiegel or something, they're all doing their thing. You have to somehow take a step back and, okay, these countries are having a very different perspective on what the term nationalism means and has entailed for their country's history versus what it has entailed or meant for American history. And for my ancestors, when they came, to become an American national was to divest themselves from their Italian or their French or Spanish heritage. And so there was this transition, and I think this is where the shift should be important, is that American nationalists tend to take on more like loyalty than it does ethnic superiority.
Okay. Now, on that note, though, I think we know what is coming, and what would be said is there is an ethnic component, right, to American nationalism, and it's vaguely white. Right.
Well, that's.
Go ahead, Lenny.
I have. Well, there's a lot of problems. Okay, so going back to Logan's point, realize that Europe has a long history replete with ethnically driven wars. World War II was the culminate. Matter of fact, World War I, the war to end all wars, were nations aligning with each other as they had done even through Old Testament times, when you see the different nations aligning with one another. And that kind of nationalism, as you know, springs from ethnicities, because nations sprang from families. they started off with patriarchies and grew. Rome and all the other, they shared commonalities of geography, they shared commonalities of language, and they shared commonalities of culture. When we use the term American exceptionalism, what we mean there is not that America's an exceptional nation because we're just simply better people than everybody else. That's not what that term means at all. American exceptionalism is we are the only country on the face of the planet that has ever been started by a group of people, no matter what their heritage, no matter what their culture, and no matter what their background, their language, they come together under a common idea. The idea that we are a government of the people, by the people, for the people. That we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. Those ideas are what knit us together. And I'm going to correct you just a touch, Logan. It's not that we forsake our culture when we come here, because my great-grandparents came from Italy as well. We don't ask you to forsake your culture. We still allow you to celebrate, Cinco de Mayo, whatever your cultural heritage may be. We ask you to forsake your loyalty to that country. All powers, foreign and domestic, right? You disavow when you take the citizenship. Well, you disavow yourself of all those, and you pledge yourself solely to the U.S. I remember one individual, an Irishman who was going to take the oath, and he was a little hesitant. His wife told me about pledging against, and his wife told him, well, you have to remember what you're doing is you're forsaking the Queen. Oh, well, I can do that. That's not a problem at all.
Yeah, you're not forsaking Guinness.
And Lenny, to add to your point, just a thought experiment. And I think some of you have traveled quite a bit. And if you're traveling outside America, say as an American, you go to China. Let me ask you, can you ever be a Chinese person? But think about a Chinese coming to America, becomes American, or Indian coming to America becomes an American, gets into this framework easily, adopting these ideas and values and principles easily. Whereas you do this in some other nation, you travel to India or other nations, you'll give away, that you are a foreigner. You'd never be able to assimilate. That doesn't matter how much language you learn or whatever you do. You'll never be a Chinese. You'll never be an Indian.
Exactly.
So
that doesn't happen.
And let me, this isn't pushback, but we'll make room here, obviously, for what was, the plight of the African, right? The plight being that the idea was not realized for Africans in this country until much, much later, right?
Absolutely.
After much, much heinous suffering. But that's what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying, that there was a promissory note. The idea had not been realized or actualized for the African American, right? So obviously we're making room for the difference between the African American story in America and then maybe later immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Poland. Although for the Irish, for the Italians, as Catholics, especially, and the Polish, it's not that they met no resistance. It wasn't as difficult, obviously, as for Africans coming on slave ships, but there was resistance to their coming and their being in New York and Chicago.
Yeah, they were Italians and Irish were considered non-white legally, as a matter of fact. So absolutely.
Josh, I mean, I'm thinking Logan pointed out the different nationalisms that were firmly connected to specific ethnicities: French nationalism, German nationalism, the British Empire. Okay, now I'm thinking then the Christian principles upon which the country were founded, now, obviously, we got to do some historical analysis here because there were Christian principles that underlied all of those European nations as well. But there was something that the the founding fathers were doing here, that at least opened the door for a nationalism that wasn't necessarily tied to ethnicity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking that there's something deeply theological there, because there is no Christian ethnicity, right?
I mean, yeah, it's foreign to the very concept of that. What unifies us as Christians is Christ. It's our faith in Him. It's the regeneration of our hearts. It's that's what makes us part of the body. We're grafted in, and so much of the New Testament is spent, and it's so explicit as well, where Paul's like has to make the point of each nation, each person is part of this body. And so as a Christian, it's completely unintuitive to think that there can be any room for any kind of ethnic superiority or racial superiority, or whatever the difference is between ethnic and racial, and if you want to go down that route. And so and then as well, you have historical ties in Christianity, in the history of America, where, I mean, the founding fathers were coming to flee religious persecution and basically have freedom of worship of the Christian Judeo God. And so patriotism, especially I think in America, because America historically has been so aligned with Christian values, is not a bad thing. I wouldn't even say it's a neutral thing. I think it's a good thing to be patriotic. The question is when, and going back to Logan's point of like when he was talking about nationalism, and he's like, yeah, what's wrong with that? Like, with the positive connotation towards it. When does nationalism become poisonous, or when does it become dangerous to not only to the faith but to society in general? And I think that's the concern that's on a lot of people's minds. And again, my question would be, what is the prevalence of this, and why is this now becoming a threat? Because in all honesty, I think you guys are right. Like this is largely a smokescreen and a deflection from CRT. The response. So the response from a lot of left-leaning Christians during this time is, well, CRT, whatever. And the real problem is actually Christian nationalism, and we're going to point to the right leaning side of the church, right? Because you don't really have that claim made about a lot of left-leaning Christians.
So Josh, we might say in principle, we would all agree it could be both, right?
Yes, in principle,
but
yes.
What's going on right now is what you're saying. What's the real problem? What's the real issue?
Right.
Is there sort of a feint tactic going on here to distract us from what is the real threat?
Right.
And to add to Josh, what he mentioned here, talking about nationalism, we need to understand that what happens here in America cannot be compared with the way things have been in Europe. We need to understand that there was a Europe before Christianity, but there was a Christianity before America. And so what I'm saying is that Europe has always functioned with this idea of empire mentality, whereas here in America, Lenny, you mentioned about this idea of we the people. That was a gift of Reformation, basically the priesthood of all believers. And it calls upon the citizens to participate in that priesthood work. And here we need to what we need to have is actually a proper definition of what politics is. And as Christians, the best definition that I have ever come across is politics is applied ethics. It's not whether you will apply ethics. The question is, which ethics would you apply? Right? There is no moral neutrality in society. And that's a deception even within the church. We have people have bought into, and we have abandoned this in any kind of engagement in politics. But what we should be doing is engaging in proper kind of politics where we apply biblical ethics, just like John the Baptist, who was willing to bring in a biblical ethics to a pagan king and getting beheaded for it.
And
right?
Jacob, there
will be consequences.
Yeah, and that'll look. I think that's a great point, because that'll look entirely different in America, for example, what it means to be a Christian patriot. Let's use that term, as compared to China. In China, it's going to be if you want to align with Christian values, you're gonna fight. You're going to be antagonistic towards the current government and regime and the oppression.
They're going to be antagonistic to you, towards you. Yeah.
So in that regard, I always say every government is a theocratic government because it is trying to apply certain kind of law. It matters as to whose laws is it trying to apply, right? So even just like nationalism, theocracy also has a subtle difference in terms of it can be understood at two ways. Whenever someone says theocratic or theocracy, we always point to what happens in Islamic world. That's not the only definition of theocracy, right? There is a right kind of theocracy where the understanding is that the land in which God has established us, as Christians, we have a call to be the salt of the earth and light of the world and bring in the right moral attitude within that culture. And that happens through the conduit of law and policy where Christians must be engaged in.
So I'm gonna approach this though from the other side, because I think we have to be balanced and have equal time. There is in the church, and I don't know the percentage, but there is probably a significant minority of individuals who are of the mindset that say, if you don't vote Republican, you're not saved. So let's take someone like Cornel West. There are people who would tell you that Cornel West will suffer damnation. Now, if you ask Robert P. George, who's, a very staunch conservative Catholic, who's befriended Cornel West, and they have very lively discussions about issues that they fundamentally disagree. But Robert George will tell you, Cornel West is my brother in Christ. What I've seen is this isn't necessarily a movement of Christian nationalism, in the sense that it's not a movement of people to say, we have to wed our Christianity to our national conservative political viewpoints that currently exist based on our Republican leadership or our conservative leadership or whatever that case may be. What this is, surprise, surprise, poor theology being taught in the churches, maybe mixed with a little bit of easy believism, where churches have done a very bad job of teasing apart the moral issues that we have to maybe take a stand on politically, and the politicians, the people whom we are supposed to love unreservedly. And again, I think that's a problem, but it's always been, in the whole of the 20th century, we've had a problem of poor theology, and it's gotten worse as our theology has gotten sloppier and sloppier. And, and you guys all know youth group is nothing more than movie nights and pizza parties anymore.
And they're not even watching good movies.
Yeah. So what a surprise. And it just happens to manifest itself in this way as much as it does in India. If you want to talk about entertainment, you have Christian doing that too. Both, in the 80s, right? There was this, you remember the whole backwards masking thing? And that whole idea of Christians trying to, stop all that ridiculousness. And then we had the whole devil's, the satanic cult worship movement conspiracy theory that,
Yeah,
that ran?
it was in all of my Judas Priest albums as a kid.
Yeah. Lauren Stratford.
That playing backwards.
So exactly. And so this has always been an issue, and it just so happens that politics is the hot button right now. So it's not a surprise that you get shallow Christians who link their politics and their faith and don't know how to separate those two things.
Well, and of course, Lenny, we tend to be more aware of history in virtue of what we do and how we think and try and study our best we can. And not everybody is. I mean, most people, like John McWhorter said, most people just live in the present. They don't know what the past is, and they really don't think much about the future in any long-term or big picture way. And that, that's an unfortunate, especially an unfortunate reality in the church, if the church hasn't taught its history, because, the erosion of, once it gets to the level of actual political policies, it's almost like, well, so much erosion has occurred at that point, right? And we know the history of, how the metaphysics and the epistemology, the shifts in the, in these domains of intellectual domains of philosophy and theology, and how, it slowly unravels over time to now where, there's been a, very sustained attack against Christian metaphysics, religious epistemology, and Christian morality for, at least back to Rousseau in the 18th century, early 18th century, and then the Romantics and so on. And C.S. Lewis talks about this in so many of his books. But so we've kind of like, it's always been there, it's been coming, and now you do have the sense that as Charles Taylor put, the modern moral order upon which the country was founded by the founding fathers, who were at least generic theists of some sort. Well, what did we expect? Now we're seeing it in the actual policies and lifestyles of people, right?
Right.
So we're a little late in the game if we're being very reactive at this point.
And we need to understand that when we question Christian involvement in politics or governance, we need to understand that a lot of people here in the West enjoy the benefits of Christian involvement in the past and the very roots of this nation, the very idea of religious liberty. I don't think secularism, if you stretch it too much, would bring you to a place of religious liberty, or any other religion per se would allow for it. It's the Christian idea that the founders even understood and maintained that distinction between church and state. But what we have done as a church, we have taken this as, we need to understand that when we talk about the separation of church and state, we are not saying separation between God and church and God and state. God is still involved. Do we truly believe as Christians that Jesus is Lord, right? And Caesar is not? Ultimately, all authorities are established by God himself. He supervenes all those structures of governance and authority ultimately. It is to him that we should appeal in terms of applying the laws of our very land. And when we do that, we flourish in that. And that's been the story of human history, of the history of nations around the world that have adopted the biblical principles and values have flourished.
And let me, because then I want to get to John, I want to get to what we think might be trying to replace a nationalism founded on Christian principles. I want to get to that in a second. But Jacob, Tom Holland, who wrote the book Dominion, who is an agnostic of some sort, but a great defender of sort of Christianity, better than many pastors and that I know. He made a point in one of his talks with, I believe it was on one of Justin Brierly's shows during the pandemic, that something like Black Lives Matters, the organization Black Lives Matter, that doesn't get off the ground in a country that has not been already imbued with Christian principles, right? I mean, you wouldn't have a Black Lives Matter movement in ancient Rome. They would just say, well, no, we're stronger, so you don't matter, right?
I as a foreigner who's lived in this country for 9 years now, I wonder, and I listen to a lot of people who raise up concerns about these racial issues, especially who come from other countries. They're so much vocal here and get a platform where people do listen to them. that doesn't happen back in their own countries. I see a lot of Indians who come here and speak about the racial issues and suffering and all those things, which I'm not saying that we shouldn't. What I'm saying is that, are they even able to see what allows for them to be able to actually voice those concerns or grievances, which they are not able to in other kind of contexts where they apply a different kind of principle and value.
Yeah, now doesn't have a chapter in Saudi Arabia.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
Let me jump in with a few comments real quick.
yeah, go ahead, Logan.
Because there was a lot said. I've just been taking notes. What?
Go ahead.
I had a few notes. I think that the 3 points I wanted to make real quick, and then if it contributes to conversation, we can continue on. The first one was the Constitution question that Josh brought right from the beginning about the survey, because I think there's room for adequate pushback when they talk about the surveys about the inerrancy of the Constitution, something like that. It's complicated for a few reasons. The first one is you have the obvious amendment process, which seems to at least have built into it the idea it didn't perceive itself as inerrant. But the tension is it is citing certain principles that we would like to hope or at least think are universalizing. For example, the idea that all are created equal. We would hope that that was universal, always true, no matter it's in the United States or if it's the foundations for other civil rights documents in the UN or so on, European Union, so on and so forth. So you have that tension. But I think what people get confused is the inerrancy of the Constitution with the question of supporting the Constitution as the method by which laws are passed and amended in the United States government or within the United States framework. And so I think it has to be careful. A lot of people try to set up these questions and the idea of either it's inherent or it's totally malleable and therefore you can throw it away. You go, no, it seems like if you want order and stability, there's going to be a process. You're going to want to say that that process needs to be abided by the best you possibly can without giving it the divine oration of God. You don't have to do that, but it has to have some sort of legal foundation which should transcend the legislative process, right? Something like that. The second point I wanted to make, though, is this idea about the alignment of political parties with Christian values. I think you're going to see that with both sides. The left is going to say, well, if you care about the poor and you care about the oppressed and the downtrodden and the widow and the orphan, vote Democrat. And the Republican and the conservative Christian go, but if you believe in stability and the rule of law and what they're going to think is equal justice, then you're going to vote conservative. There's a huge debate. I don't think it's necessary to go into it right now about how political parties are formed and the idea of you're kind of forming some sort of compromising or sort of community for political action. But what I think the real issue is when you get really down to it is the threat of Christian nationalism, I think, is what they're trying to say is the idea of forming around something that you hate to get those people back. I think that's what we're seeing in politics, and people kind of naming it whatever they want. With Christian nationalism, I think what it is evangelicals widely voted for Trump. Therefore, evangelicals are nationalist. We're going to throw white evangelicals in there. Therefore, Christian nationalism is somehow a compounding of this idea of white evangelicals who supported Trump. I think that's the political messaging that's going out.
Right.
But I think the underlying problem, to at least grant them something of legitimacy, is this idea. I mean, Chesterton goes back to it when he talks about war. You know, it's not about who you hate, but what you love. Are you protecting what you love, or are you attacking those who you hate? And I think what people are sensing now is politics is not about loving even the oppressed. It's about hating the white evangelical, hating the radical communists, hating these people, forming your groups to just attack each other. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the real problem, going back to what Tony was saying, is that this is what you're seeing in politics. And now they're just naming, going back to what Lenny was saying about labeling and trying to figure it out. Now, I think going to Jacob's point, though, is we do have to make room where you can love your country. And this I think it's a misuse of calling inerrant, but like Chesterton talks about this orthodoxy. I think you can find scripture, this idea that we love because God first loved us, this unconditional love. If you love something, it's not blind. It's not making some ethno-nationalism, racial nationalism. It's the idea that you love something first, and it's through love that things change. And we see this through every level of society. If it's friendships, if it's your family, like if you want to help your kid, you don't beat your kid and hope that he just gets the lesson. It has to be through love as the foundation, and that love has to come undeserving of the kid. Like, the kid didn't deserve your love, and that's how you give it. In the same way, I think people forget that if you can't first love something, if it's a family member or even the nation, you're not going to see any form of legitimate change. It's just going to be hate and trying to what we're doing right now. One president comes in, you tear down the former president. Next president comes in, tear down the former president. There is no room for growth because there's no room to love your own country.
Well, that's good.
And with regards to government, I think one of the important things to understand, and as Christians, our task would be to analyze, at the same time keep a check that the government of any sort, like be it church or family or civil government, right? It remains within its own jurisdiction. The problem happens when it jumps from one to the other. And I think the jurisdiction of a government is in the place of justice, right? Biblically, if we see, Romans 13 is very clear, to administer justice. And its task is not to actually involve in issues of compassion. That's the task of the church. When the government jumps into being compassionate, what it does, it usually steals from those who have and wants to actually give to those who don't have. And there is a huge problem there, right? It's not done willfully. But when Christian citizens are involved volitionally in the task of compassion, right, they do it volitionally, not by force necessarily. So I think remaining within the jurisdiction is the key point with any kind of governance. And as Christians, we have a responsibility to keep a check on it.
So let's look at a couple concrete. I mean, taxation is it's obviously that's a huge debate, and can't get into that issue of how the government should operate with regards to taxation. But you know, if we think about what Logan said, and then take some of these concrete issues. Now, one of these issues did not happen in the United States. One of these things, this is in a few incidents that happened up in Canada that we're all aware of. One was the arrest and incarceration of a pastor in Edmonton, I believe, where, you know, there was violation of COVID restrictions. And then just more recently, the church was infenced by authorities. And then there was even a small scrap where some people tore down the fence. And so there's issues like this now of where it looks like government maybe, Jacob, overreaching, right, into sectors of life where it doesn't belong, or maybe it does. And I think we could make a connection that instances of governmental restrictions that were where there was resistance in the last year in America, a lot of those people who were resisting restrictions were also being sort of labeled as Christian nationalists, right? So let's touch on that one. And then I want to get to the Georgia issue as well with the voting, the identification and voting, and the massive response we saw there, not just by the government, the current administration, but by big business, right? And to include even like Major League Baseball and stuff. So let's do a little bit on what happened up in Canada first. I don't know who wants to jump in on that and give us some thoughts on what we saw there with regards to Pastor James Coates' church and the shutting down of that.
Well, I think it's a good example of how you can have two peoples who share much of their culture society-wise. Sporting events, right? I mean, Major League Baseball, NFL teams, National Hockey League is in both countries, US and Canada, common language, a lot of yeah, we don't drink Tim Hortons down here, and they don't have In-N-Out. So, but other than that, there's a lot of commonality. They're a nation mostly of immigrants as well, and we see a lot of that. However, they are part of the Commonwealth. They come out of strictly the British tradition. They are not independent, and therefore their government was rooted in an old world standard, much the same standard that Europe was rooted on. And it grew secular because at its base it was secular. And so I think this is, again, when we talk about American exceptionalism, this is where the differences lie. The idea in the Bill of Rights is that the people are supreme, not the government. Now that's trying to be changed. And to my lament, as you said, nobody remembers the past and nobody cares about the future. And so what do they do when they live in the present? They say, I need someone else to save me from wherever disaster is threatening me. Government, can you do so? That's the salvation that they seek. Because that's the salvation that they seek, if you thwart that and exercise your individualism, even for reasons of faith, you are an enemy of the state in the eyes of individuals. Now, we see a similar thing going on in the Second Amendment. The people who oppose the Second Amendment are people who don't like guns. Just, they've never shot them. They don't have any desire to deal with them. And that's one of the drivers. Because they don't like them, then it's easier for them to castigate them and criticize the gun as being the evil instrument. Because people don't go to church anymore. Canada is much more secular than the US. It's easy for them to castigate faith and say, why are you people putting all these other people's lives in danger? Because you're meeting together and you could catch and spread the disease. But it comes to a question of authority. And the problem is that their moral framework is based on a top-down view. Government rules over the people, and therefore it is in the people's best interest. It's very who is the guy that Locke undercut? I'm blanking on the name right
Hobbes,
now.
maybe?
Hobbes. It's very Hobbesian. Yes.
All right. So, and you say, it's not that government just rules over us, but it really takes care of us well.
Yes.
With a lot of ease, a lot of comfort,
It's for your
and
safety.
a lot of entertainment as well, because, the more socialized the government is, the more the entertainment also that we receive will be from the government or through the government. Jacob, you've been tracking the issue of Grace Life Church up in Edmonton a little bit more in detail. What have you seen in that, based on what Lenny just said too? Is that what is kind of going on up there?
So, with my limited understanding, we need to understand that Jason Coates, he was imprisoned for about a month right before this barricade that came about his church. And there were allegations that he didn't abide by the regulations put out by Alberta Health Services, AHS. And this barricade was actually put by AHS. And the argument that Pastor Coates was giving was basically, we don't consider this to be genuinely a pandemic issue where those who are not affected by it has to be quarantined and separated, and right. So from his viewpoint, that does make sense that he took a stand where he believed in what he believed in and took a firm stand on it and committed to that. And in doing so, he went to the prison and came back. And so AHS has put these barricades around this church on the claim that they were not continuing to keep the regulations that they've been given. Now, the thing is that one of the arguments that came about was this. Now, the narrative that is sold to the Canadians is a narrative made up by AHS, right? That's what their church is saying. So for their business, for their running, a certain kind of narrative is more beneficial than the narrative that Christians would want to actually say, or perspective that Christians would want to say, saying that This is not legitimate. We want to meet. We want to worship. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, it comes down to this question of who determines that we are allowed to worship or not worship, and how we should worship, and when we should worship. So this impingement on this whole aspect of worship has become a huge issue in Canada, where Christians, this church in particular, have gone underground now. They're meeting underground, not true in public.
So I want to point something out that was quite insidious. And I just so happened that I recently started reading this book by Jacques Ellul, Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitude. Probably scarier even than 1984, because it's an actual real life, like philosophical explanation of how propaganda functions. Immediately after they put the fence around Grace Life Church. And then there was some resistance to it where a small group showed up and they tore the fence down. And then they even felt sorry about tearing this just chain link fence down. So again, similar to like the thing at the Capitol where the guy just broke in and said the Lord's Prayer. I didn't know what else, but
this
was even more mild. But on the heels of that, there was some other quote unquote Christian ministry that put out a video with this very smiley, lovely looking young Asian girl, basically showing how wrong Grace Life Church was to break the rules of the state. And we should be happy that other churches have found safe ways to worship from home. And the body of Christ does not need to meet. We have our laptops, we have our cell phones. We can worship privately in our own spaces. And I kid you not. Now that video has been taken down. But it was amazing to me how quickly, now I could only think that's got to be from the government itself, but it could not, it could be from a legitimate Christian ministry. And when again, reading Ellul's book, I mean, we got to also make room for the fact that we are being propagandized, because the propaganda machine never rests. It's in every domain. That's part of what he talks about. Modern propaganda has to be like. Everything is political. Everything has to be propagandized all the time, everywhere. So on that note, Josh, let's quickly just swing over then to where there was a law passed in Georgia where people would have to display their IDs when voting. And the big backlash was not just from the Democrats, but it was from Major League Baseball, Delta Airlines. I mean, the whole gamut of culture is put into play in a very political way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my question would be, why? What is especially coming off the back of this last election? Like let's say that let's assume for the sake of charity that in this last election there was absolutely like no issues. It was just like any normal election. In reality, the conservatives were listening to all these crazy conspiracy theories. Let's just assume all that's true. Even if that was the case, if Georgia voters were to show their IDs and we were to legitimize or further verify the identity of each voter, wouldn't that further substantiate their win? In like, let's say in the upcoming election, or if we apply that to the last election, the thing that doesn't make sense is if the reason behind this is to further the legitimacy of the voting process, why would either side have an issue with that? And so, yeah, I think those are the kinds of questions that come to my mind, Tony, when I think of this kind of thing, because especially in today's world where it's so much harder to trust any kind of resource. It's trusting people, trusting, where do you get your what sources of authority do you seek truth from? And at the end of the day, and this is to tie this back to our audience here, if Christ is not your source of authority, if the Word of God is not your source of authority, I mean, you have to pick something else, and that thing is gonna, like, and in this case, it's the government. In Canada, people are looking for a way for basically salvation, right? There's mental disorders are on the ramp, and people are having the higher drug rates than ever, higher mental disorders than ever, and people are scared and people are freaked out, and they're wondering, what do I do? And so, I guess on a more pastoral note, the only answer to that is the way, the truth, and the life, and that's Jesus Christ.
And worship is warfare. We need to understand
Yeah.
that, no matter where we do it.
Amen.
And
Yeah.
there will be forces against it, and
Right.
there'll be, big
So
forces.
we shouldn't believe the narrative that if you want to get back into your physical church building and worship together, that you're some kind of Christian nationalist who wants to take over.
I mean, the fascinating point of comparison is just the Supreme Court ruling 2 days ago for the state of California, who slapped California a 5th time. And it was fascinating that the court actually said that this is the 5th time we are overturning the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals on this issue. You cannot hold worship to a different standard than other aspects of society, and you've got to stop doing that. Now, they don't have that in Canada, so you could see where the problem is, because they don't have the First Amendment in Canada. Our founding fathers were prescient enough to say, we want this written down. We are not going to come together as a country, and realize that's what the amendments are. They're saying they're a promissory note. The country will only work if these values stick. That's what the amendments are. That's what the Bill of Rights is all about. We won't join together.
But Lenny, if you hold to those ideals and the Constitution, aren't you a Christian nationalist?
I would say I'm a patriotic Christian. I hold to those ideas. My nationalism,
That's our new term.
My Christianity is not defined by my nationalism. I would give up my nationalism, and I may have to much more quickly than I would be comfortable admitting. But I'm more ready to give up my status as an American than I am as a Christian. Absolutely.
Ultimately, we are the citizens of heaven, right? Just that's a given fact, and we got to be living in light of that. And every time we forget that and put our national citizenship and identity over that,
right?
That is problematic.
That's the key, and that would be a problem in the church. And I think there are some people who do that.
Yeah, I think we're not saying that there aren't some people, right, who are taking the nationalism.
Yeah, I don't think it's rampant in the church.
Yeah, well, and I think, again, that's where I think we have this battle of propaganda, political propaganda, which is so difficult to tease the truth from what is just, like, as Logan pointed out earlier, a sort of realpolitik, to be honest, right? I just got to defeat my political enemies, period. And however I get there, so be it. Which, again, there's where you would want some kind of Christian principles underlying your politics and your governance, because we wouldn't want to say that every ends or every means justifies the end.
Even if you look at Romans 13, right? Romans 13, obviously everybody quotes it. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Well, wait a minute. Ultimately, in the Constitution, who are the governing authorities of this country? We, the people.
We, the people, right?
And I want to pick up what Lenny was saying about the contrast between Canada and the United States, because I think this is a good example when you see this fight with the church, that we have it's not just this, we have, a couple different procedures. It's a ground up, fundamentally different form of government. And when you get to sit down, and this is what I would encourage calling people in Canada or your friends in England, talk about political issues. And it's fascinating because the United States did make some very fundamental value decisions that Canada and England and, the greater Commonwealth didn't make. One of that is saying that the fundamental responsibility of the well-being of the government isn't the president, it's actually the citizens. And that goes straight into the Declaration of Independence when they're responding to England, which is interesting because it's kind of a similar response in which the parliament gives the king, a handful of years prior to that. But they start instituting these laws. They use the Constitution. They say there's certain fundamental rights on human value, on the citizen's responsibility within the Declaration of Independence. But then you start getting interesting separations of power. And so there's conflicts in the United States that would never, ever happen in Canada or England. For example, with the southern border, where you have Trump deploying the National Guard and then California redeploying. I mean, could you imagine? There's no way that in Canada you could have a province redeploying military units. For them, that's just a very vastly different. But it's a relic of the U.S. government in which they said the states have the right to form their own militias and their own defenses in certain capacities. They can be deployed in, adjoining states and stuff like that. So you have the responsibility of citizen, and this goes into, I think, and I would maybe ask Jacob what he thinks about this, or in Lenny, and anyone else could jump on this. Do different governments require? Okay, so you have this idea. Okay, we're Christians. We're citizens of heaven. We're also part of communities. We have some responsibility to the community, right? Love your neighbor yourself. But what's interesting is it seems like certain political communities have different responsibilities, and I'm wondering, does that affect? Are there like occasional responsibilities, more of a technical word, occasional responsibilities that Christians in certain parts of the world have that they wouldn't have in another part of the world? So, for example, the United States, it seems like part of the government is citizen responsibility, virtuous citizenship, as sort of loving your neighbor as yourself, and some part of that political community. It's saying, well, you got to be responsible, maintain government. Is that an additional, I guess, responsibility that American Christian would have that maybe an English Christian or an Indian Christian or a Chinese Christian wouldn't have?
So Logan, let me give you some one practical example of something which I see as an American privilege, but not many Americans would consider that to be a privilege, sadly. And this happened, I was actually at a barber shop, and this lady who was Vietnamese immigrant here in America, and she was complaining about being called to jury duty. And she couldn't understand this idea. Why am I supposed to go and do this thing? I'm just a citizen. Why am I supposed to go and do this? But here I'm sitting as a Christian, and I'm saying, what a privilege this is here in this nation. No Indian has that. No other nation that I know of has this idea of people being involved in the jury process of making a decision, because we are not just dependent on this one judge sitting up there making the ultimate decision. It comes down to the jury, the people who are involved. So I'll just give that one example to you, which again is from this very idea, I believe, that we include in the priesthood of all believers and participate in the conduct of a collective enterprise.
And the right to a trial before your peers, your community, right?
Exactly.
I mean, Logan, I just think it is it's a very probing and very provocative question, because I think so many Christians do feel like, because Christ is Lord and that's my ultimate authority, I don't want to really get involved in the political realm. I don't want that additional responsibility. So I think it is a good question to bring up, but maybe that additional responsibility is something you're called to in virtue of Christ having you here in this country.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to check out, right? And just say, I don't want to deal with it. But Lenny, that doesn't seem like a good option, especially if we consider what might be on the horizon to replace what we have, right?
Yes, exactly. And to Logan's question, in some sense, I think that there is ultimately a responsibility, regardless of what nation you're in, for Christians to behave Christianly towards the greater community, because every government has, although the government does wield the sword without, no reason, right? The Lord has put them in power. That doesn't mean that they can abuse it for any necessary means, and we should then kowtow to that. And that wasn't the way the early Christians did it either. They changed the society from within. They even though they didn't enjoy a government that recognized those rights, they still sought them out. But they sought them out usually through sacrifice. My favorite story I tell everybody is the history of Telemachus. If you remember, Telemachus was a monk from the East, right? And Rome was Christianized for at least 75 years, but they were still having gladiatorial games because that's what everybody liked. That was their culture. And Telemachus crawls into the arena in Rome and says, brothers, these people are made in the image of God. This should not be. And what did the crowd do? Did they salute him? No, they had the gladiators kill him right where he stood. But within a year, the outroar that a Christian saint would die for upholding the sanctity of life reached the ears of even the emperor, and Caesar banned gladiatorial games throughout the Roman Empire. That's the way change has historically happened throughout the world. So if you're in a China, we pray for our brothers in the house church and the ones who are getting dragged away and put into prison. We help support them. We put pressure on those in Iran and Iraq who hold, or Pakistan, who hold Christian missionaries or even converts in their jails because they violated blasphemy laws. Those kinds of things we want to see, not merely that individual freed because he's a Christian. We want to see freedom so that even maybe the Jehovah's Witnesses would be able to walk the streets and knock on doors. We recognize that it's a two-way street because that's a fundamental aspect of who we are and what Christ understands the human condition to be, the value of human worth.
And here in the West, I would say that Christians should be careful that they would not buy into this narrative, secular narrative, that Christians have nothing to discuss about politics. They shouldn't. Keep it private. Yeah. Sadly, a lot of Christians have bought into this idea.
The old liberal Protestant view of the privatization of faith, where then Christianity and the culture almost become the same thing, right? Christianity is just sort of a functional, the churches are just sort of functional arm of the welfare system, you know, and this is one thing that I pointed out when the pandemic hit, or that was concerning me. And of course, it's not novel to me, but just the idea of, you know, you can have just a state, we can wind up just having a state church, and hey, go believe all your things about heaven and hell and Jesus having a dual nature, fully God, full. We don't care about that. But when it gets to the more concrete issues, you know, you got to toe the party line, right? So you have your sort of state version of the church, which China has, right? China has its I forget what it's called, the three-way church, or it's got its state church.
Yeah.
But then there are these underground churches, right? And we worry about having two kinds of Christianity in a culture, one that is sort of anointed by the secular authorities and one that is underground and doing the resistance work. And we had that obviously in Germany in 1942 as well, right? But how we do that resistance work, I think Lenny was pointing out, is important. And that's the Telemachus story.
That's the thrust of the question. It seems like in the founding of the Americas document, there's the call to be held morally accountable by its citizens. So that's my question. So in Rome, we have it where maybe that wasn't in its founding documents, but this kind of funnels into the question of Christian nationalism. Do Christians have an obligation to hold the government morally accountable by the invitation of the government's own founding document? I don't know. I don't know if that conversation is taking place right now, but it's interesting that it seems that if it comes up from the people, the government is held accountable by the people. You have the freedom of religion. So does it would do all of them have this obligation?
I agree with that. And to put another contrast between Grace Life, in all of the shutdown, those essential, the label essential services became dominant, right? What are the essential? Well, hospitals, you can't limit the number of people in hospitals because those are the facilities that care for the physical health of the individual. Well, sure, but what if individuals aren't merely physical? What if they're physical and spiritual? The church is the only institution that humanity has to care for the spiritual aspect of individuals. It is the only one. There exists no other. And doesn't that make it as essential if persons, you are assuming, you almost ask the question then, do you have to assume a materialist point of view to shut down churches and not hospitals?
Yes, you do.
And that's more part of that long story of erosion that I mentioned earlier, Lenny, where we even see each other as spiritual being, like C.S. Lewis said, nations will come and go, empires rise and fall, but everybody you meet in the street is an immortal entity, right? That's going to last forever. And and this is where I think one of the issues with a lot
and
of
it's
critical
sad
race
that
theory we've seen is it has a very materialistic sense about it, in that it's not really about anymore the liberations of our souls, as long as we got the material stuff taken care of.
And it breaks my heart that every legal conflict in this area, including by folks like John MacArthur, grace to you, and all of these folks who clashed with the government, raised it on religious liberty issues and never on the fact that we are an essential service issue. Even the church did not argue that way. Why not? We should.
Yeah, that would have been a good opportunity. I'm sure there were a few voices scattered here and there. But
No,
that would have
I
been a
asked
good
I asked my
opportunity.
church that question. I said, if we don't even view ourselves as essential, why would anyone else?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a very simple question. I think that we kind of missed during the COVID pandemic.
I'll try and wrap it up with an illustration, because Lenny gave us a historical example of resistance that led to change through sacrifice in Telemachus. There was a good movie years ago with a young Robert De Niro and Liam Neeson. It's called The Mission. Jeremy Irons, you might have seen it, or if you haven't seen it recently, I would watch it again. And the end of the movie, of course, there's a group of Jesuits. They're in the mountains of Brazil, and the Portuguese are coming in. They're going to destroy the mission and enslave all of the indigenous people who have become Christian, Catholic at that point in the mission. And Robert De Niro's character is a former slave trader who is also a soldier. He's got all the requisite skills to fight back against the Portuguese. Jeremy Irons is the head of the missionary and the head of the Jesuits there. And they go different ways. De Niro decides to take his character, Mendoza, decides to take some of the indigenous folks and some of the priests who are willing to physically fight back, right? Maybe it's a just war scenario, could be. And Jeremy Irons disagrees with him, doesn't stop him, lets him go. But then Jeremy Irons takes the rest of the villagers and they just hold mass. And they do a procession. And they proceed directly into the cannon fire of the Portuguese soldiers who are coming to enslave them. And, one asks the question, if there were any Portuguese soldiers that day who maybe converted to Christ, had a conversion of their souls, do you think it was in virtue of the guys who were firing back at them, or in virtue of them seeing these guys who were holding mass with the crucifix up and just walking straight into their cannon fire? So, it will matter that if we have a Christian nationalism, it's a Christian nationalism of the latter type, the type of walking into the cannon fire, as opposed to maybe firing back, which maybe there was some criticism to be had during the Trump era, if we want to call it an era, 4 years, that maybe there was a little bit too much of that firing back. And that's maybe not the road that we can really take if we're going to have, if we're going to maintain our identity in Christ. So, Lenny, I'm going to give you the last word as our guest.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation. There's so much more that we can say about this, of course, lots of ideas here to unpack, but ultimately, again, we are sojourners in this world, just as Abraham was. We are, if my kingdom were of this world, my people would fight, Jesus said, but my kingdom is not of this world. That doesn't mean that his, kingdom isn't worth asserting, and there will be struggle. We seek God's kingdom building process through our physical bodies now. I think Dallas Willard does a great job of unpacking that, the idea of the kingdom of God coming right now. But ultimately, as your example, our faith is in God. And if God is in control, then an angel could come and wipe out the 186,000 Assyrians, and we could be, going from famine to feast overnight. So our trust isn't in politics, and it should never be. Our trust is in God. We use politics humbly with our open hand, and because of that and our trust in God, his will be done.
Amen. All right,
Amen.
gentlemen. Thank you.